Welcome to week 5 of the course on global civics. Last week we saw how climate change rendered national borders inconsequential, and one could argue that world economy is a similar dynamic. After all, we have seen how financial engineering in the United States or bookkeeping in Greece around public finances had tremendous impact on employment and growth all around the world. This week we are going to ask Amar Bhattacharya to walk us through the state of world economy, the 2008 global crisis, and the way global governance has shaped around the economy. As you listen to him, try to ascertain the difference between climate change and the economy. Are they essentially similar or are there differences? Like last week's lecture, Bhattacharya's lecture is rich with graphs and data and different units. Do not be disheartened. If you are confused at times, you have the option to stop the lecture whenever you want. You will also have a separate file for his PowerPoint presentation, which you can study afterwards in greater detail. Here is Bhattacharya's rich lecture.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as the time may be for you. My name's Amar Bhattacharya. I'm the director of the G24, based here in Washington, D.C. I'm going to talk to you about the structural transformation in the global economy and the prospects for sustainable growth after this crisis that we have experienced, and the implications that this structural transformation has for global governance. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will use. It's intended to help you follow the lecture, but also, of course, to review the points after the lecture. So the outline that I will follow has 4 points. The first is a description of the structural transformation in the global economy. The second that I will talk about is the impact and the legacy of the crisis. The third is sustainable growth beyond the crisis. And the last is the implications for global governance. So let's begin with the first point, which is the structural transformation of the global economy. The world economy really is at a historical juncture in terms of the relationship between developed and developing economies. This change has been accentuated by the crisis, but it had begun to set in well before the crisis. For almost 60 years, developing country growth had tracked that of the developed world, and because of depreciating currencies, there was what we called a divergence between the developed world and emerging markets and developing countries. During the past decade, that trend has been forcefully reversed. And even though there is not a cyclical decoupling, meaning that the advanced economies and emerging markets and developing countries are linked in terms of cyclical ups and downs, there has been a structural shift in terms of the growth between advanced and developing countries. And I want to show that through a number of slides. So if you look at this slide, you will see that there's, as you can see, quite close correlation between developed and developing country growth for almost about 50 years. And in the last 10 years or so, there has been a divergence with developing country growth now significantly higher than that of advanced economies. And you can see this more clearly here where, on the left you see the cyclical links, and on the right, you can see when you take the trend, there is a clear structural break between developed and developing countries. This is not just a story of China and India, although China and India are a very important part of the story, but it is a very broad-based transformation that we are talking about. Prior to this recent crisis, out of some 150 emerging markets and developing countries, 94 countries were growing at a rate of more than 5% per annum, and a majority of the emerging markets and developing countries, 8 out of 10, growing faster than that of advanced economies. This trend is expected to continue, although the crisis has affected in a downward way both the growth in advanced economies as well as the growth in developing countries, and I'll come back to that a little later. What is particularly striking is that for the first time, low-income countries, and especially sub-Saharan Africa, are part of this trend. So we are now seeing, in some sense, a convergence that is very, very broad-based. What has been underpinning this growth? Very strong macroeconomic performance with a virtuous cycle of savings and investments, growing trade, and very importantly, macroeconomic resilience. And nowhere do we see that more than during the recent crisis. Again, now let's look at a few figures to make these points. So the first slide here shows you that an increasing number of emerging markets and developing countries are on the path of convergence. What does that mean? It means that they are going much faster than the world average and much faster than that of the developed countries. Second, you can see that income groups are gradually converging. The number of countries that are low-income countries have been declining over time. The number of countries that are middle-income countries have been rising over time, and that there are a growing number of countries now that are migrating from middle income to high income. And that, of course, is all very good news. Underpinning it, as I said, is that improvement in long-term savings. If you look at the savings of the developing world right now, in every developing region, savings rates are higher than in OECD countries. Indeed, the rates of savings are something that we would have thought very, very difficult to achieve 50, 60 years ago. So this improvement in savings and the kind of underlying growth performance, exports that's underpinning it is one of the really strong sort of indicators of the transformation that I was talking about. This savings, of course, has allowed for higher investment and higher growth. Nowhere has this been true more than in East Asia, but as you can see, it's true in other regions, South Asia, and very encouragingly improving trends in sub-Saharan Africa as well. Now, this structural transformation is changing the landscape of the global economy. The sustained differential between advanced economies and emerging markets and developing countries means that the share of emerging markets and developing countries in the global economy measured in purchasing power parity is now greater than that of the developed world. Purchasing power parity means comparing like for like. It's not at market prices, but goods being kind of compared at the same price across countries. And that's indeed the way you should compare different economies at different levels of development. There is a similar trend between the G7, which was the old power, and the BRICS, which are, you could say, are the new emerging power base, and so there is a rebalancing taking place. And this convergence is not only a convergence of growth, but it's also being boosted by the convergence of purchasing power parity prices with market prices. Again, let's look at how do the figures look with regard to the story. And as you can see now, emerging markets and developing countries in purchasing power parity is greater than that of developed countries, and that the gap will now progressively widen the other way. Second, you can see that the BRICS are rapidly closing with the G7, so indeed they are now the new powerhouse of the global economy. This, as I mentioned, the growing convergence is being facilitated by the convergence between market prices and purchasing power parity prices, and you can see that here. Now let's move to the second part of this talk, which is on the impact and the legacy of the crisis. The crisis has been deeper and more prolonged than had been anticipated. What the dotted line, the solid lines tells you is the WIO or the IMF forecasts that were made in at the time of April 2010, and the solid lines tells you the IMF estimates and projections from the latest WIO, which is the one that was issued a couple months ago in April 2013. And what you see is that certainly, the crisis has been prolonged, particularly because of Europe. If you can see in emerging markets and developing countries, there has been a little bit of dampening of growth compared to previous expectations. But for Europe, the downturn is much more pronounced and more prolonged. So as a result, that has affected the whole global economy. And indeed, Europe has been at the center of the crisis. Why is that? Well, one is that there was considerable delay on the part of Europe in establishing an effective firewall. Why was a firewall important? In order to provide investors confidence that Europe wasn't going to melt down, but that took quite a lot of time to put in place. As a result, investor confidence, consumer confidence, quite severely affected in Europe and beyond Europe. Second, the excessive emphasis on austerity has not led to the expected or anticipated improvements in debt sustainability or the necessary internal devaluation, meaning improvements in competitiveness. Third, the deleveraging by euro area banks has been a huge dampening factor, not only in Europe, but for a period of time in emerging markets in terms of capital flows. An important point of debate has been between one view, which is the need for demand rotation versus what I would call demand support. Many advanced countries, many economists argued that in the face of this crisis, there should be a shift in aggregate demand to emerging markets and developing countries and to surplus countries in particular, and that this would allow Europe and other countries affected by the crisis, including the heavily indebted countries, to recover from the crisis. What has happened is that there has been huge demand rotation. Deficit countries like Turkey, South Africa, India, Brazil, they all actually widened their deficits very significantly. And surplus countries like China and some parts of East Asia reduced their surplus quite significantly. So I would argue that the emerging markets more than did what was necessary on their part during the crisis, but what did not happen was adequate demand support from the advanced economies, especially from Europe. The final point regarding the crisis is that because advanced economies were not able to do as much as they might have done with regard to the fiscal side, they were in some sense forced to rely on monetary policies, and including unconventional monetary policies, meaning policies beyond the normal. And these policies have had spillover effects across the borders in terms of higher inflation, in terms of volatile capital flows, in terms of volatility of commodity prices. So certainly the policy mix in advanced countries has had negative spillovers. Although, speaking from the other side, if of course the economies have collapsed, everybody would be worse off. So in a way, there was probably no choice, given that the fiscal choices were constrained. But this is something that will be a big issue going forward on the other side now, which is the unwinding of these unconventional monetary policies. So again, here are some figures to illustrate what I just mentioned. As you can see, euro area deleveraging, which is in its impact on lending, has been a big factor. Now let's go through the impact of the crisis on emerging markets and developing countries. The immediate effects of the crisis was large, especially on export-oriented economies through the trade channel, but the recovery has been faster and more sustained for emerging markets and developing countries. Financial flows were also affected during this crisis, as I mentioned, partly because of the euro area deleveraging, but this has not been uniform. There's been quite a lot of differentiation. Third, commodity prices during this crisis were affected, but have remained in general on the high side. These high commodity prices have had differential impacts across countries, and I will come to that in a second. The overall growth rates of emerging markets and developing countries have been quite resilient, as I had mentioned, and this has allowed them the room for counter-cyclical policies. In this crisis, more than any other crisis, emerging markets and developing countries resorted to counter-cyclical policies, which has helped buffer, in some sense, the worst of the crisis in terms of growth and employment. However, as a result, many countries have seen reduced fiscal space, which of course makes them more vulnerable in the future, but also constrains them with regard to investment and spending going forward. So some figures to highlight some of the points. As you can see, exports dropped sharply during the crisis, both for advanced and emerging markets. But as you can see in this next slide, by the purple line, emerging markets have recovered much more sharply in terms of exports after the crisis than advanced countries. Financial flows, as I mentioned, were affected, but differentially. So you see that, for example, foreign direct investment dipped but has recovered quite strongly. Private debt and portfolio flows also dipped very sharply, and since then have recovered, but primarily in terms of portfolio equity and bond flows. Bank lending is still quite depressed compared to before the crisis. Official development assistance has increased, but at a more modest pace than one would have expected. What is striking is the resilience, as well as the huge increase taking place in remittances, which has become a major source of foreign exchange for emerging markets and developing countries, especially some emerging markets and developing countries. As I mentioned, commodity prices have tended to increase, reaching an all-time high in 2011, although in real terms they are still lower than what they were from the peaks of the 1970s. And food prices are projected to remain steady, but at relatively high levels, which of course poses challenges for food security and for the food insecure. As I mentioned, the impact of commodity prices is not uniform. A striking fact today is that when you look at emerging markets and developing countries, in contrast to the general impression and the historical kind of view of developing countries, a majority of emerging markets and developing countries are today net commodity importers, not net commodity exporters. And what is particularly striking is that low-income countries are large commodity importers of food as well as fuel, making them doubly vulnerable to food and fuel price shocks. As I mentioned, emerging markets growth has been much more resilient, and you can see that very strikingly in the second panel. As you can see, there was a dip in emerging market and developing country growth, but nothing compared to what happened in advanced countries, and they have also rebounded significantly after the crisis. And as I mentioned, fiscal space is now a new issue after the crisis. Let's move to the third part of this module, which is on growth beyond the crisis. The differential growth that we saw between advanced and emerging markets and developing countries is expected to be sustained. But there is significant heterogeneity across regions and countries. This is not a uniform story, and I'll come to that a little bit more. Third, the emerging markets and developing countries are a long way from the frontier of productivity growth, and hence the potential for catch-up gains is large, which is very good. But more recent analysis, including by the IMF, shows that the potential output growth is not as strong for some countries as it was thought before the crisis, in part because of structural constraints to growth. So looking at some figures, this figure is very striking. As you can see, for almost 40 plus years, developing countries and high-income countries were roughly growing at the same pace. But since roughly the mid-1990s and accelerating in 2000, there is this gap between developing countries and high-income countries, and the gap is the greatest between developing countries and Euro area countries. And this is the structural shift that I had mentioned earlier. As I also mentioned, there is considerable heterogeneity across regions. East Asia remains the most robust and with the highest growth, followed by South Asia, very encouraging improvements in Sub-Saharan Africa, growth in Latin America, moderate, nothing exceptional. In MENA or the Middle East region also reasonably well. And in Europe and Central Asia, quite a lot of volatility reflecting what has been happening in advanced Europe. As I also mentioned, emerging markets and developing countries, a long way from the productivity frontier, and that's what this is intended to show in terms of per capita GDP, because that's a good indicator of kind of long-term catch-up potential. As I also mentioned, the outlook for some countries, potential output growth for some countries has been downgraded, and this includes very predominantly the BRICS, including India, China, and Brazil. Looking ahead, there are some major challenges to sustaining growth in emerging markets and developing countries, and as their role increases, of course, that has implications for the global economy. I want to focus on 4 particular challenges that I believe will be very important. The first is infrastructure development and financing. The second is the jobs crisis, and more beyond that, the prospects for long-term employment creation. Third is the worrying signs of growing inequality, growing income inequality, and with lagging countries, meaning that although the world is doing better, there are some countries that are lagging behind. And finally, the challenge of sustainability, meaning climate, particularly climate impact and resilience, remains an enormous source of concern. So first on infrastructure. Infrastructure is critical for many reasons. It's critical for growth. Emerging markets will need to expand and upgrade their infrastructure if they are to meet their growth aspirations, especially because of the way that the composition of growth is changing because of the greater importance of network externalities. Second, there is a significant structural change taking place in the world in terms of shifts. The most significant of this is urbanization. In the next 2.5 decades, we'll add 2 billion people to the planet. All of them will be in urban settlements, which will put huge demand on infrastructure. Second, industry and services will be the driving force of the new economy, requiring upgraded and much better infrastructure. Third, you can't have a world where the growth is concentrated in a few parts of countries. In large countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, etc., you need to spread growth. And the challenge of inclusion is both a geographic one, but also of including people who are disadvantaged, and that requires both physical as well as social infrastructure. And finally, as I mentioned, the world, the planet requires much better, much more acute attention to climate, both on the mitigation side and also adaptation. If we get our infrastructure right, we will help the planet. If we get it wrong, we will destroy the planet. That's how important infrastructure is. Now, all of this adds up to a huge bill. The work that the G24 has done with London School of Economics and the Green Growth Institute suggests that we will need to increase infrastructure spending from a current level of about 800 billion to more than 2 trillion. That's a huge increase. And a big question is, where is the financing going to come from for this kind of infrastructure? It does not make sense to pay for all this financing on the back of today's citizens, because infrastructure is very long return, and today's citizens are relatively poor. They won't be able to afford that infrastructure, especially in poor countries. So a financing challenge related to infrastructure is a great preoccupation, and it is in that context that the BRICS leaders announced their decision to establish a new development bank. Second, as I mentioned, the jobs crisis continues, especially in Europe with record unemployment. And today the challenge of unemployment is a challenge in both developed and developing countries. So far in developing countries, more rapid growth has been a very welcome aspect in terms of absorbing more labor. But as growth begins to slow down and as more and more sectors are seeing limits or even shedding of employment, a big question is, where are the jobs going to come from? And in emerging markets and developing countries, as you can also see, the trends are quite different across countries. But one common challenge that emerging markets and developing countries, or many, face is the challenge of youth unemployment. It's not only been a huge issue that has been highlighted in the Arab Spring countries, but even in Asia, this is going to be a huge issue going forward. As I mentioned, inequality is also increasing. Nowhere is this more true than in the US, where the top 1% accounts now for 23% of national income, and where the top 0.01% accounts for 12%. That degree of inequality is nothing but obscene, and it is certainly something that has to be addressed, not just in the US, but in other countries as well. Increasing global integration has been associated, unfortunately, with growing in income inequality in many emerging markets and developing countries, but with very different starting points. This growing inequality, as Professor Stiglitz has argued, is compromising the equality of opportunity and long-term productivity growth. Environmental sustainability and sustainability more broadly has come to the fore. Greenhouse gas concentrations have increased from less than 300 parts ppm of carbon dioxide in the 1800s to around 450 today. Although temperature sensitivity seems to have abated a little bit in recent years, this could eventually lead to temperature increase of more than 5 degrees, or which would really be catastrophic. And this already we are beginning to see high probability, increased probability of extreme weather events and a rising global sea level. This could have not just short-term growth impacts, but huge impacts in terms of potential migration of hundreds of millions, conflict, and the like. So addressing the climate mitigation and climate resilience issue is clear. Ensuring that environmental sustainability and climate resilience is crucial for long-term growth and development. And it's also very clear that investing in low-carbon growth requires clear public policy and institutional development. This is not just going to happen by leaving it to market forces. We need to be able to manage risk, both commercial and political. And what will be very important here, particularly in the absence of a comprehensive global agreement, is to lead by example. So let me end with the last section, which is the implications for global governance. There are really two kinds of forces that are shaping the world's governance right now. The first is growing interconnectedness. This is happening in many, many fronts, in the economy, with regard to finance, with regard to climate, with regard to crime, you name it. And this growing interconnectedness poses new challenges in global coordination and governance arrangements. Many of the institutions that were created for tasks that are yesterday's tasks, and there are gaps between the mandates of existing institutions. In the area of the economy and finance, the recent waves of financial crisis have underscored the importance of coordination in the economic and financial sphere, but it has also highlighted the inherent challenges of such coordination. It is made very clear that we went through a phase where the G20, which was created in response to the 2008, initially to the 1997 East Asia financial crisis at the level of finance ministers, and then in 2008 in response to the global financial crisis. The G20 went through a period of euphoria of, we now have a group that will take major decisions, to now a period where people feel that the G20 faces many of the same complexities, challenges, and blockages as we have in other governance arrangements. The new second point to be made is that this new wave of interconnectedness and global challenges coincides with major shifts in relative positions between old and new powers. And let me elaborate on both of these. So if you look at the architecture of global governance, several important developments. The G20 has emerged as the premier forum for global economic and financial coordination. Not only has it replaced the G8 in that sense, but there has been a significant, and there is a continuing evolution of its role. Second, in parallel, there was the establishment first of the Financial Stability Forum, now called the Financial Stability Board, which is like a network of the different institutions dealing with global financial markets and their regulation. And third, there has been a significant strengthening in the role of the IMF, with an augmentation of its resources and enhancement of instruments, and particularly of its surveillance capabilities. So the institutional architecture on the financial side and economic side has three main elements. There are others as well, like the OECD, etc. But the three main elements is the IMF, which has an overarching responsibility for international financial stability with a range of instruments. In interest of time, I won't go through all of them. You have them there. Second, the Financial Stability Board, which has a plenary of countries. Membership in the Financial Stability Board is limited to the G20 and a few other countries, so it's not a universal body, which is a big limitation given its role. But it has also now put in place a number of elements. And then under the G20, we have kind of global discussions of surveillance, as well as the G20 map, peer review processes and the like, which serve to reinforce and indeed give some steerage to the institutional architecture. So in sum, the architecture is, there's a complementary architecture between the IMF and the FSB, including on multilateral surveillance. The IMF's comparative strengths are in integrating macro financial and financial perspectives, as well as integrating bilateral and multilateral aspects in Article 4 consultations, which is the main instrument that the IMF has for undertaking surveillance and policy dialogue with its members. It has a wide array of instruments to address global systemic risks, the WIO, the GFSR, spillover reports, as well as early warning exercise in collaboration with the Financial Stability Board. The Financial Stability Board's strengths are its network of financial stability experts and institutions, its access to national supervisors, its interface with the BIS and standard-setting bodies, and the synergy between the plenary of the FSB and the different working committees and groups. The second force, as I mentioned, is that there's a big shifts in power taking place. As you can see in the decade of the 1980s, all of the top countries in terms of share of global GDP were G7 and other advanced countries. Brazil at that time was the highest rank emerging market. China was number 12. By the time we are in 2000, China is number 3. By 2015, China will be number 2. India will be number 3. Russia, Brazil, Mexico, Korea, Indonesia will all be in the top 15. So big changes. And of course, whatever is going up on the other side of the ledger is going down, and you see big downward adjustments. Less in the US, more in Europe, as I had shown earlier. The contributions to world growth also shifting very sharply. China now contributes more to world growth than 3 times more to world growth. It has contributed over the past decade than the United States. 4 times more than of Europe. Even India is contributing more than the US, 1.5 times that of Europe. So big shifts, as I mentioned, in terms of growth and growth contributions. And if you look at contributions by decade, you see the same thing and the ranks that are associated. In closing, let me say that, on the governance side, the unfortunate thing is, while we have had these dramatic changes taking place in the global economy, they have not been reflected in the governance arrangements of the IMF. And the 2 lines here give you kind of actual quota shares and calculated quota shares of emerging markets and developing countries. And as you can see, they have been increasing, but much less, and much less in levels and as well as in pace compared to their increases taking place in the global economy. And second, amongst emerging markets and developing countries, the most sort of disadvantaged and disenfranchised are the low-income countries, including those of sub-Saharan Africa, who see their kind of shares in governance actually decline. And although they are seeing a modest increase in their weight in the global economy, of course, by the virtue of the fact that they are poor, they are disadvantaged very much by the quota formula that is currently in use. This shows you basically that GDP and in purchasing power parity terms, as well as in market prices, are increasing in sub-Saharan Africa, but it is still well below their kind of notional quota, not notional, but the quotas agreed to after the 14th quota review, which means that they would not be eligible for any increase for some time. What is, if these countries are disadvantaged, what is the reason for it? And the main reason is the overrepresentation of Europe. The managing director of the IMF has always been a European. The board of the IMF has 24 seats, 8 and sometimes 9 directors are from Europe, and Europe has a 34.7% of the kind of actual, it has a 33% of actual and 35% in terms of calculated quota shares, even though if you look at its share in GDP, it's only around 23%. So a very important part of the governance change in reflection of the structural shift will be the willingness of Europe to accept a somewhat reduced role, even though by organizing itself, it can actually play the role probably as the most influential force in the international financial institutions. So with that, let me thank you. It's been a pleasure. And as I mentioned, you will have the PowerPoint and you can look at it, and I'll be glad to take questions from you, assuming the organizers find a way to communicate those questions to me. Thank you.
I have two key takeaways from Bhattacharya's lecture. One is convergence of the affluent West and the rise of the rest. It seems like the rest are growing faster than the West. And it's not just China. 90% of the world now grows faster than Western economies. This is huge. This is the reversal of a 200-year trajectory. And if this continues, it's going to shape our understanding of interdependence, our mood, the tonality of our diagnosis. It will, of course, influence the way we assign or we take responsibility. The second point is Bhattacharya's assumption that economic decisions by key actors do not have detrimental consequences in other countries. Therefore, the global governance he suggests and the global governance we have is built around light coordination, disclosure, more transparency. This is also in line with the reading that you are going to make for this week. It's by Danny Roderick from his book, The Globalization Paradox. Danny Roderick is a distinguished economist based at Harvard, and he has just recently moved to the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. And he distinguishes between clear global commons like the climate and economic policy, where he argues both the gains and the pains are essentially national. There are cross-border consequences, but he argues they are minimal and they are manageable. So your writing assignment for this week is going to be the evaluation of the Bhattacharya-Roderick argument that when it comes to economy, the global governance we need should be about light coordination. As usual, you have 500 to 1,000 words to make your case.